everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about today. Now, you might be like, Mr. Wagstaff, you got a different flag behind you today. Well, I got the North Carolina flag behind me today because today we're going to be talking about the Constitution of the North Carolina and how it came to be. There's been multiple versions. So it's in the curriculum. And they're like, hey, talk about how North Carolina got created and the process through our government. As I'm researching it, I'm like, hey, North Carolina, you know this don't make us look good, right? And they're like, no, I'm sure it'll be fine. You know, we want to leave all stones unturned. We understand, you know, we have racist past. There's things we need to talk about. I'm like, oh, no, we're going to talk about that. We kind of look incompetent. And they're like, nah, it'll be all right. You just go ahead and teach it. All right, here we go. So here we go. We're going to talk about the North Carolina government and how it got founded in the North Carolina Constitution. Got my flag to stop waving here. This flag, the flag alone. I'm going to do a whole lesson on that one. So the flag gets a reprieve today because there's some issues with the flag of North Carolina. So let's get on to what we're talking about today. So we're going to talk about the Constitution of North Carolina. So we're going to pick up really with North Carolina as its own state. Now, I tried to say it without smiling because it's kind of rough when you really dig into North Carolina history. So I'll start out. I'm just going to tell the history, and you might see some chinks in the armor, and then tomorrow when we talk about the flags and some other stuff. It's silly. A lot of this stuff is silly, and I'll be honest with you. But before I jump into this, let me tell you the story. So in 1663, North Carolina breaks off from South Carolina, become our own state, and we have the North Carolina Charter of 1663. We are still part of England. We're still a colony in 1663, but a lot of North Carolinians referred to this as the Constitution. The real North Carolina Constitution, all right, is going to happen in 1776. So 1776, the Declaration of Independence is signed, and America breaks off from England, and we create our own state and our own constitution. So we were very close, very similar to the way a lot of other states had done this. Under the Articles of Confederation, we had our own government. We had these Declaration of Rights, very concerned early on how people would be treated under the government. So a lot of rights were given to the people. This is kind of ahead of everybody else's time. So not a lot of times we can say that about North Carolina. We're usually way behind the times on a lot of things compared to even other southern states. Just North Carolina in general, wildly behind the times often here. But 1776, we're with the times. We created our own constitution. It really has a very weak government. It's so weak that the governor of North Carolina, all right, so the governor is like the president of a state. The governor of North Carolina, I got a picture of him here. Actually, I don't have a picture of him. There's literally no picture of Cornelius Harnett, who is the first governor of North Carolina once they became a state. Now, that's kind of on purpose, not the fact that they don't have a picture of him. Understand there's no cameras then, but paintings, a sketch, something, nothing, all right? So the reason that is because the governor was not viewed as a powerful position at all. Actually, the complete opposite. Because the term governor really made people think of the royal governors that were here from England that basically told people what they could or couldn't do. So when they created the new North Carolina, all right, they had a governor that had almost no power, had 1-year term, couldn't veto anything, had almost no power. It was kind of a figurehead, the head of the executive branch. But the government does create 3 branches of government, which is pretty impressive. Still, pulling from John Locke and Montesquieu and the other stuff that had been talked about at that time with Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, which are not North Carolinians. So they do have a bicameral legislature like we still have today. So this is one of the things that has passed on because we have 3 different constitutions. This is just the first one. Unlike America, we've had one. We've had 3 entirely new constitutions in North Carolina. But the thing they all agree on is having a bicameral legislature, like a state Congress, all right? And it's called the General Assembly. And this was the building that the General Assembly worked in from 1794 to 1810. And then they got a nicer one. This is one from 1811 to 1831. that is clearly designed like a plantation house. It very easily could have been. North Carolina had slaves. Slaves, about guarantee you, worked those grounds. I doubt it's a plantation itself, but there's absolutely slaves that work there. And then the next General Assembly building will be from 1840 to 1963. So throughout this first Constitution, which is going to go up to 1868, they had 3 different legislative buildings that were in use. So weak governor, legislative was the big part. They were very restrictive on who got to vote. You had to be a property owner, and that's going to stick around for a really long time in North Carolina. You had to own property and you had to be white. All right. You also had to have certain religious requirements, all right, in order to vote. So voting in North Carolina was a lot stricter than other places in the country. The court system, more or less, was similar to that of the United States, just on a smaller scale at the state level. However, we created our Constitution in 1776, just like the Articles of Confederation came out at the same time, which gave all the powers to the state from the federal level, and it was trash because it couldn't really enforce any of their laws, and it took about 10 years after Shays' Rebellion for the federal government to realize we need a new constitution. And so in 1787, the United States government creates a federal constitution. But each state, as we're talking about here, also has their own separate constitutions. North Carolina has the same issues that the Articles of Confederation does. There's really no way to enforce these laws. Taxing is a problem. There's all these other issues. So North Carolina, it took the federal government 10 years to figure it out. North Carolina, 1835, almost 50 years. Actually, 59 years for them to be like, hey, we got to fix some of this. Behind the times, North Carolina. So there's a convention in 1835, and they've really, really intensely changed the Constitution. They don't throw out the 1776 Constitution, but they make a lot of changes to it that really increases the strength of the government. At this point, they're going to move the governor has the ability to have 2-year terms. Let's not get crazy here with it. But it does do a lot to kind of strengthen the government and make it more effective. So it's going to work, all right? So the question here is describe the difference between the 1776 Constitution and the amended version, basically the 1835 version. Like what changed and why did they have to change that? And what's kind of silly about the fact that it took them 50 years? All right. So answer that, and we're going to move on. So the North Carolina Constitution of we're getting ready to have a whole brand new one here as we're telling the story, in 1868. Here's why. There's a little scuffle, it's an understatement of eternity, called the Civil War. So the Confederate States in 1861 are going to break off. North Carolina is one of those and become their own separate nation in the Confederate States of America, and they're going to fight against the United States of America, and the Confederate States of America are going to lose. So once the war's over, the South is forced to come back into the United States. This time period is called Reconstruction. The federal government, the United States government, makes the states create new constitutions that strongly align with the values of the federal government. So they're forced to change their constitution. So you have to throw out the old one because the old one allowed slavery. That was a big issue here because that was the main issue of the Civil War. So the new Constitution in 1868, when it comes out, one of the first things it does is it abolishes slavery. It also allowed non-property owners the ability to vote and universal suffrage of people over the age of 21, even black people. By all accounts, this is very progressive. Like this, all right, North Carolina, all right. They even expand the governor's time in office up to 4 years, give them a little bit more power. Okay. This, honestly, if you look back on it, everybody, you know what? Go high five North Carolina. For 1868 standards, this is pretty impressive. They actually got rid of any religious requirements to vote. Like, all right, North Carolina, impressive. Well, if you saw my last lesson, which hopefully you did, in the 1890s, 30 years after this Constitution, you're going to have the Wilmington Race Riots and the coup d'etat. All All right, and there is a white supremacy backlash against black voters in the United States. From that point on, from 1900, the state government aggressively fought and chipped away at the progressivism that was the Constitution of 1868 to make it nearly unlivable for, that's figuratively, but as far as being an effective citizen of society, black people just were not allowed to be equal citizens. You got Jim Crow laws and poll taxes, which because of the grandfather clause, only black people would have to pay poll taxes. And then literacy tests. Literacy tests are ridiculous because they're literally designed to prevent people from being able to vote with just ridiculous questions. Like a literacy test. Cross out the number necessary when making the number below 1 million. Man, what does that have to do with literacy? Like, the questions are just ridiculous. So it is literally designed to keep black people from voting. North Carolina completely embraces Jim Crow laws and segregation. And the 1868 North Carolina Constitution started out being very inclusive. And over time, these amendments that get added to it are designed to segregate society and keep black people as a second-class citizen in North Carolina. So the question here is, explain why the 1868 North Carolina Constitution was so supportive of the African American rights at first, only to gradually change them over time. And I want to clarify this. Why were they so nice to African Americans in 1868? What had just happened? Who was making them make a new constitution? All right, so think about that when you answer this. So pause me, answer that completely. We're moving on. All right, so we're moving up to 1971. Civil rights movement took place. We talked about that in depth in this course. In 1971, North Carolina says, you know what? This is pretty messed up. So they got together. There's gonna be like 70 amendments to the Constitution to like make it appropriate, and eventually they just balled it up, threw it away. So no, we just got to start all over. So the current Constitution that North Carolina uses, all right, even though there has been 20 amendments since then, came out in 1971. So the current version of the Constitution, the 1971 version of the Constitution, in response to the Civil Rights Movement, that North Carolina says we got to redirect courses. So it does strengthen the power of the governor in this new one. Interesting here that what it allows is that governors serve 4-year terms. Governors are only allowed to serve 2 4-year terms back to back, but there's no term limit. So how this can play out, and this is Jim Hunt, all right? There's 2 pictures, same guy. Jim Hunt was the governor of North Carolina from 1976 to 1984. So that's 2 terms. Well, he can't serve again, so he had to stop being the governor. Well, in 1992, he runs again because he's allowed, because it's not consecutive. And he serves from 1992 to 2000 in 2 consecutive terms. And then he can't serve again because he's 2 consecutive terms. So there's no term limit. You just can't serve more than 2 consecutively. The legislative branch gets a new building. This is the current one where it is now in Raleigh. The president's mansion. This was built in 1883. That was pretty impressive. That would, I mean, to be over 100 years old, it's in really good shape. That's a nice house. So the question here is, describe the environment in 1970, 1971, 1972, that would have to lead to an entirely new constitution. Like, why did they just ball all up and throw it away? What was the major issue? And who's the one that benefited from this new constitution, the same one we have today, all right? It's basically North Carolina trying to right a wrong, all right? Explain who benefited from it and why they had to start all over. All right, so what does the North Carolina Constitution require that the federal government does not? All right, because there's all these protections in it, state, federal, but what does the North Carolina government require that the federal government does not? There are requirements to vote in state elections, because the federal Constitution says nothing about state elections, but the North Carolina Constitution basically makes a requirement on what you have to do to vote in state elections. So I doing research on this, and I thought I knew some things, and it still shocked me. You know what is, and this is being recorded in the 2021-2022 school year. Today, when I'm recording this, you know what is still part of the North Carolina Constitution? Literacy test. Present day literacy test, still part of the Constitution. Now, what's crazy about that is they literally threw out the 1868 Constitution, trashed it, made a new one to stop being unfair, and added a literacy test into it. I've never heard of it ever being used or implemented, all right? And it's not based on race or sex or anything like that. And it doesn't say you have to take a test. It says that you have to be able to read and understand the North Carolina Constitution in English in order to be able to vote, which is crazy. And they've come up multiple times to like repeal it, but it's not really being enforced. But yeah, that's still part of the North Carolina Constitution. Not as strict as what the original reasons were, but it's still kind of crazy that is a requirement, even though there's no enforcement of it. Because I've voted in North Carolina since I've been able to vote. Resident requirements to vote for president. Basically, since you tell the state which way you want them to vote, there are requirements for how long you have to live in the state in order for your vote to count. They're relatively lenient, but they want to make sure you're not bumping around states during an election and voting in multiple states. North Carolina will disqualify you from being able to vote if you're a convicted felon, depending on the situation. If you made it up, it's a fluid rule, but that is not part of the federal Constitution. And one of the things that they have added, it is an amendment, North Carolina voter ID law. You now have to show an ID in order to vote. We talked about this in a previous lesson, how that can be questionable for the motivations of that, because out of billions of votes cast, I think there were 31 legitimate voter fraud cases since the year 2000. So the North Carolina voter ID law is now a part of the Constitution. Also, it wasn't until the 1990s that an amendment was added to the Constitution of North Carolina that allows for the governor of North Carolina to veto laws, very similar to what the president can do. So present day, very little is different between the federal government and North Carolina, even though it took North Carolina a lot longer to catch up, even by comparisons to the rest of the southern states at times. The question is, why are states and not the federal government in charge of providing education in their own states? You know, I didn't talk about this, so let's talk about it right now. All right. So the biggest thing in the Constitution, all right, and I should have had a whole thing on this, the states are responsible for the education in their state. They tax their people, they get money from their people, they pay for education in their states. All right. The federal government doesn't deal with this. This is a state mandated across the board in every state. The reason is because the people in different states have different cultures, and they want to be able to align their curriculum and what works best for them in the educational system with the people in their own state. The federal government does it. The people in Maine and the people in Hawaii present day may not have the same needs education-wise, so it's really hard for the federal government to have a fell swoop curriculum for everybody. So the states, really from the beginning, are the ones that are in charge of providing for their own education inside their state, and the federal government, in theory, does not have any control over that. But so the question is, why are states and not the federal government in charge of providing for education in their own states? Just answered that there for you. All right, that's all I got for you. Ooh, you're going to like tomorrow. See you guys later.